multiple disciplinary approaches to ending homelessness webinar series. Thank you guys again. We are going to be having a couple people joining on right now through the intro, so I'm just going to let some time for that to happen during the introductions. But first off, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Valeria Cervantes, and I'm here along with Gershom Hiron, and we're both excited for you guys to be on today's webinar with us. So thank you again for joining on. I do want to just quickly go over some housekeeping items before we dive into the presentation today. So let me go on to the next slide. Just please make sure to keep your microphones muted at all times throughout the presentation. If you guys have a question, you can raise your hand. There is going to be the opportunity to ask questions throughout the presentation, so you can do so then. Or you can also drop it in the chat and then we'll address it when it's time to answer the questions. So please just make sure to keep your microphones muted. And again, if you haven't already, please sign in by typing your full name, your title, your organization, your agency in the chat. And let's see. I see one hand raised already. You can go ahead and unmute. Kathy, do you have your hand raised?
Kathy, if you're speaking, you're on mute. We'll come back to it. We can move on, Valeria.
Okay, so we're going to go into the agenda for today. All right. So as I shared, my name is Valeria and I'm here with Gershom, and we're going to be hosting the webinar today. I do want to go ahead and take the time to introduce our presenter who's providing the training, with Patricia Leslie from Urban Initiatives. She's going to be going over a trauma-informed care. So we want to go ahead and thank Pat for joining us today. Pat, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself or give a little more of your background, go ahead and feel free to do so.
Sure. So I'm Pat Leslie. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. I am, as Valeria has already said, I'm from an Urban Initiatives. I have a master's in social work and I have a PhD from Loma Linda in policy and research. But most importantly, I provided direct homeless services for more than 2 decades with severely emotionally teenagers in residential treatment, with homeless individuals and families, with DV survivors in a variety of public and private settings, but not in South Bay of San Diego because I don't speak Spanish. So I envy those of you who do. Today pulls together a couple of different presentations, and it's the first time we've done them in tandem. So bear with me and please give feedback along the way. But we're ready, I think. I think it's a fairly interesting topic. So do we want to go ahead and start?
Thank you, Pat. Yes, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and change slides. Here we go. So the floor is yours,
Great.
Pat. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks. And I encourage you all to give me feedback along the way. So if I'm talking too fast, if I'm talking too loud, I tend to get nervous a little bit around time. And so it's as though talking faster and louder will make it easier for you to understand. And I know better than that. But so feel free to give me these kind of like, wait, signs. Okay. So this is sort of a talking head one since I'm not in the room with you and can't interact very much. It is a topic that can stir your emotions, even though there really are not too many graphic points in it. You can still feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable. So I really encourage you to take care of yourself. take a stretch break, etc. Between the two halves, we are going to take a minute for a deep breath along the way. The session was customized for you, as I said, so we'll have to see what happens. Next slide, please. First, I want to acknowledge that. Next slide, please. Sorry, I should have already cued you. I'm getting better. We want you to be welcomed and not overwhelmed by this, even though it's a lot of material and it's a long session. I want to acknowledge that the information comes from a variety of sources, which you see on the slide, and the presentation strives to really connect the information from multiple perspectives to offer a very thoughtful understanding of trauma and trauma-informed care, trauma-aware communities. Next slide, please. So this is where we're headed today. The purpose for the first section is to introduce sort of the tip of the iceberg. What is trauma? What causes trauma? What are our reactions to trauma? How it impacts daily life? And then in the second portion, we're really going to delve into trauma-informed care, trauma-aware communities, and some implementation helpful hints. Next slide, please. So understanding trauma. What's trauma? What are some misconceptions? Trauma versus crisis, complex versus pervasive trauma, and situational and cultural influences. Next slide. There's a fairly simple 3E as opposed to 3D definition of trauma, is that trauma is an event or series of events experienced as harmful or life-threatening and having a lasting effect on physical, emotional, mental, psychological, behavioral, social, or spiritual well-being. It overwhelms our ability to function optimally. Next slide, please. So what's a crisis then? What's the difference? A crisis is an unstable or a crucial time or state. It could be that when a decisive change is impending, right? You need to make a change, you need to make a decision. A sudden impact on physical, emotional, mental, psychological, behavior, social, and spiritual well-being, sounding pretty familiar like trauma, right? But crisis and trauma share some aspects, some impacts, but crisis tends to be more time limited than trauma, and trauma is a result, and crisis is an event. Next slide, please. So 5 misconceptions, right? 5 misconceptions about trauma include that it's a single event that is a crisis, that it comes from negative stress only, that it's unexpected, that it's violent, or that it is universal reaction to certain events. We know that the exact same event may be experienced differently by each person and may be responded to differently. Next slide, please. So to reframe some of those misconceptions, trauma can be a single event. It can be a series of events or a situation or circumstance that repeatedly overwhelms our ability to cope. And it depends on our own abilities, right? It can derive from both negative or positive stressors, changes, and situations. It often is unexpected, but can be an anticipation of a negative event. In fact, can be an anticipation of an event that intends to change our lives, such as a wedding, right? Weddings can be traumatic, wonderful and traumatic, right? It can come from a variety of types of experiences that go beyond violence or even beneath violence, if you want to call it that. It depends on a person's experience or reaction to the events, the stressors of the situation. Next slide, please. Trauma has many forms. It can be both complex and pervasive, right? Some trauma is referred to as complex because it's multiple events. It occurs at an early age. It has long-lasting and significant impacts. Virtually all trauma, however, has some level of complexity. And it is influenced by personal traits, such as the phase of development that you're in, age, for example, or life stage, race, gender, ethnicity, and historic context, physical capacity and cognitive abilities, right? Social and cultural expectations, learned coping mechanisms, and prior recovery systems, right? And systems that involve and available resources or options that we have to assist us in adjustment. Next slide, please. So some examples. personal traits, age, such as the phase of brain development or brain atrophy as you're aging, the ability to understand abstract comments, or the dependence on others for survival, both as young people and as we age, right? System involvement, such as involvement in corrections or military or child welfare or immigration that impact our context, right? And systems responses during crisis. Do our systems around us assist us? And that's something we're going to talk about in part 2. So intergenerational or historic perspectives also have an influence. So parents or adult caregiver experiences, child welfare experiences, as we just noted, racial, ethnic, gender identity, and histories, such as the BIPOC riots, so Black riots, and such as genocide, such as the Holocaust, such as internment camps for the Japanese, right? System responses and policies, such as military service, veterans experiences, etc. And next slide, please. So some of the examples, and again, my caution is that these could have emotional impact for you. Please make sure you take care of yourself. Turn off the sound if you want or need to. So intergenerational, that parent experience we just noted, is that real live case is a student whose parent was hidden underneath corpses for survival as a child. That student did not experience that, but then learned from her parent that she was to be silent during crisis. When she was feeling overwhelmed, she needed to not breathe, she needed to hold her breath, and that was critical. Taking no action was critical to survival. Think about that, how it might influence her ability to interact with our systems that require her to respond, right? Historic perspectives, such as racial and ethnic identity, such as examples, right, or photos of images in school books of lynch mobs, for example. Historic can also be triggering. The stories of the Native American adoption trains, right? Holocaust stories, right? All of those can be traumatic and are traumatic if you belong, particularly when you belong to a group that has been impacted by them, right? And then systemic responses, such as for veterans, many of you may know that the Filipino veteran experience in serving our country was not always glorious, right? Is that Filipino military served in the same way as other military, risking lives. But when the wars were over, and even when their military service was ended outside of wartime, they were not eligible for the same supports as other military. They were not recognized as veteran. And that can be fairly traumatic, right? Next slide, please. So some of the cultural and social factors are cultural belief systems and social norms also influence our trauma and its responses, such as our religious or spiritual beliefs or practices about survival and who's taking care of us and who's responsible, right? Shame and honor cultures, right? Social norms, independence, control, rebellion. Let me give you a really quick example of shame and honor cultures and an incident. So in our society, car accident with someone from a male from the Middle East who was on his way to work, who was then delayed at work, got to work and said, you know, I had a car accident, but it's okay. It's okay because I already took care of it. I already said, you know, if it is my responsibility, I will handle it. If it was your responsibility, you've already been forgiven. No exchanging of information at the accident scene, no follow-up for insurance. As far as the individual was concerned, the incident was then over because they had reestablished that there was no shame to be had, that it had been rectified. A pretty different experience than what we're trained to do in the car accident, right? Get out your insurance card, da-da-da. So just an example of how that might impact your experience of a traumatic event. So perspectives on resistance and resilience. What do we expect, right? And a hierarchy of importance. What is more important to our culture? Is it a sense of community? Is it self-esteem? Is it safety? Is it independence, self-care, service, or sacrifice? And so, for example, in some cultures, you first ask about how the person's cows are doing as opposed to their family members. Next slide, please. So some causes of trauma are violence and beyond, and we're going to look at each of those items on that cube slide. Next slide, please. So some causes of trauma, remembering that trauma is the reaction to the event, not the event itself, right? But some contributors to trauma are political violence, torture, forced displacement, reacculturation, medical and physical illness, pain, loss of capacity, death, invasive processes, right? Being cut, for example, having surgery, lack of resources to meet those common human needs, persistent environmental factors such as a lack of resources, poverty, homelessness, social supports, hypersensitized situations, lack of mobility or control, such as violence survivors. Next slide, please. Causes also are natural disasters such as fires, floods, or hurricanes we don't have response to. In fact, I didn't know until about 2 weeks ago that you could have 3 tornadoes in the same community at the same time. That was a shock to me. So again, in terms of causes or contributors to trauma, human disasters, accidents, wars, terrorism, environmental or infrastructure failures, violence, interpersonal, community, or societal violence. And here I just want to take a moment. You recognize those, family violence, abuse, community violence, robbery, assault, gang violence, etc. But one that we may not talk about very often is the occupational vicarious normalization of violence, which we're going to talk about in part 2. But we carry, in American culture, we carry language that minimizes some of the violence or trauma, the keys that might traumatize someone else, that might be reminders, such as, let's use bullet points, right? Or shoot me an email, just as normal examples of things we do in everyday life that might be underlying triggers, and even the word trigger, right? Underlying stimulus for someone to re-experience some trauma. So next slide, please. So violence. We often think about the tie between violence and trauma. It has a very close relationship with trauma, right? And there's varying intensities and frequency. I wanted to show you some of the results of a 6-year study of national data on trauma and domestic violence. And you see that on the right-hand side of the screen, where domestic violence in underage youth, so less than 18 years, about more than 60% of it tends to be male, and male with a growing number of females that's occurring. And again, even in the adult population, about 1/3 of it is male domestic violence, which we often don't think about. We often think of domestic violence as violence against women, right? And in fact, that's how we name our legislation. So head injuries are prominent, fractures of limbs are prominent. And then what happens when you are treated medically, right? So you get discharged to home, or seniors, mostly white seniors, are impacted. And then highest severity scores and highest death rates are among children, again, under age 17. Next slide, please. A disaster, however, tends to be a single event, could be a series of events, but tends to be a single event that is an act of nature, an act of God, impacts the whole community of people at the same time, interrupts basic needs and safety, can stimulate collective responses where we pull together, right? Can strain the resources that are available, and often needs or requires a rapid policy response. We need to declare a disaster so that we can get assistance. Next slide, please. that disruption in terms of meeting human need happens at every level of Maslow's hierarchy. You're probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, where the physiological needs for air, water, food, shelter, etc., sleep, are survival needs. And when those are disrupted, it's hard for the higher levels of functioning to occur. The safety needs is actually a sense of safety, not just the physical safety that you're experiencing, but your sense of safety. So some folks who have lived in trauma-ridden, more violent communities have a different level of sensitivity to violence in the community. And those then feed into the sense of loving and belonging, right? Love and belongingness, to your sense of esteem, your self-respect, your status, your recognition by others, and then self-actualization, how much power you feel you have in over your life. Next slide, please. In terms of ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, which you may have also know considerable background for. ACEs is about the experiences and exposures in childhood, but prevalence data also shows that this sincerely impacts adults and transitional age youth. In fact, some of the impacts are significant, such as 64% of US adults report experiencing one or more types of adverse childhood experience before age 18. And nearly 1 in 6 of them experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And there's lifelong impacts of those. In the lifelong impacts impacting health, mental health, and even longevity. A series of ACEs in terms of longevity shortens your life, can shorten your life dramatically, up to 20 years. And also creates situations, adverse situations, say for if you've been adverse childhood experience before age 6, can impact you again at age 15 or 16. Next slide, please. So age matters in this. In terms of children, not only does age matter, but the co-occurring, repeated, or intergenerational patterns also influence. So if it's not just the child, but it's also the parents of the child, it influences the ability to cope and change. It influences how you respond to trauma. And then there are some simple low-cost early interventions for impacting ACE, right? So adverse childhood experiences. We'll take a look at some of those in the part 2 of the training. But for example, just having pediatricians trained to ask about adverse experiences in children can indeed help deter some of those lifelong impacts. Some of the groups at higher risk are particularly youth of color, ages as teenagers, African American youth, particularly in low-income urban areas, and American Indian, Native Alaskan children and youth, and refugees, and those with long-term disability or LGBTQ orientation. Next slide, please. Invasive shifts in belief system also impact you. So it's an uncontrolled change. It puts your belief system up against your reality. It undermines a sense of trust or safety. There's some of that happening in our community right now in terms of our systems that are designed to keep us safe, right? Or we've relied on them to keep us safe, and some folks are feeling more exposed, right? Exposure to dissonance, system disparities, such as reentry experiences, refugee immigration status, second generation status, and systemic inequities and socialized responses to those inequities. Next slide, please. Occupational hazards and secondary trauma also influence your response, right? And so occupational exposure to danger, the frequency and intensity of it, your trained responses to it can impact how you respond to an event and find it either traumatic and life-threatening or not. I'll throw in something here that I have never said in this training before, which is my son-in-law, great Navy rescue. I'm going to call him a rescue diver because he dives comes down out of the helicopter and into the water. He says he's a rescue swimmer. So he's a rescue swimmer. But when you think about his life and daily training and what he does, his sense of danger of falling off a ladder, for example, or climbing up on a roof is nothing, right? Whereas me climbing on a ladder or me climbing on the roof can find that a little more threatening, right? So occupational exposure to danger also helps influence how we respond, right? Secondary trauma. When we're connected to others in trauma, such as homeless services or domestic violence services, right? Reintegration efforts for those who have been incarcerated. Just some examples, right? Vicarious trauma, that is the hearing or the retelling of events, and caregivers, not only your personal trauma, but multiple risk factors that you may have in response. Next slide, please. So some reactions to trauma. Next slide, please. And we're going to take a look at each of those 6. So first, there's the think, act, feel wheel. It used to be called the FAT wheel, the feel, act, think wheel, assuming that feeling was the initial response. However, the wheel can be entered into at any point. And given some sensitivities, it's been renamed the TAF wheel, right? The think, act, feel wheel. It is a conceptual framework that says that you need a balance of thinking, cognition, a balance of emotion and action in order to optimize your functioning, in order to function well. When one aspect is dominating, the other aspects are deteriorate or are muted, right? So to regain functioning, you have to refocus energy on creating a new balance. So for example, if you're overwhelmed by feelings right now, you might need to take a deep breath, change your physical reaction, and refocus your thinking in order to regain control. If you're overwhelmed with thoughts that you can't take action, sometimes again, you need to take a deep breath, focus then on your feelings or your circumstances to then gain control over the overwhelming thoughts, right? So what happens when a level of response is on autopilot? Next slide, please. Our brain actually has a stress response system. It is a built-in alarm system that is automatic. It involves several different parts of our anatomy, such as the brainstem, which controls our survival, right? Our heart rate, our breathing, prepares our body to react. The limbic system provides emotional control, right? The amygdala, is the smoke detector that seeks out potential threats, senses the potential threat. The hypothalamus is the loudspeaker. It communicates that threat to the rest of the body. And the neocortex then regulates the emotions and behaviors. It's the last phase of brain development, however, so you can't expect young children to have good control there. It influences or controls reasoning, planning, and problem solving. It determines the level of danger and then reacts to reduce the overwhelming experience by shutting off some of the capacity to think and then act. Next slide, please. Not all stresses, however, are traumatic, right? Is that in that brain, mind, body continuum is we may experience those differently. And as you've been exposed, I think probably, is that there's a fight or flight response. But we're going to add to that the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses, right? So it is traumatic if not, when all parts of your brain are not available, right? The emotional brain lingers and continues to sound an alarm. It remains in survival mode. It stuffs pieces of your experience into various parts of your brain to gain capacity to reason or act again. And that leads to secondary trauma things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're going to talk about EMDR and responses to that in part 2. So there are also residual effects after the situation ends, right? Those warnings, alarms, and alerts, those what are called triggers in the industry or stimulus, right, remain as part of our thought processes, right? They release, reignite, or interpret what others see as non-dangerous into something that we see as dangerous, right? And is a disproportionate response to the situation at hand. And so, next slide, please. So, the brain during trauma takes information, images, noises, and actions. It reacts first, and then it thinks later. It responds based on the perceived threat. May not be an actual threat, but a perceived threat. The emotional brain senses the threat, right? The limbic system sends the alarm. The thinking brain goes offline. It becomes not available for reasoning, right? And the individual may have learned to fight, to save themselves, to fly away, to run away, to freeze and not take any action, like the young woman I talked to you about earlier, who was taught to be silent, right? Or to fawn, which is to then pretend as if, to go along with the situation, to simply mirror whatever the threatful situation the other persons are seeing. And then there's a redistribution of information, that is that think, act, feel, will. There's recoveries, and there's residual impacts. Next slide, please. So give it some thought. You have an automatic cognitive and emotional response to the same image in different contexts, right? The brain reacts differently as it perceives those images, those experiences in a context. It disrupts your balance of functioning, right? And you need to retrain the brain and other response system. In fact, the experiences also retrain the brain to see the situations differently. Next slide, please. So here's an example. In that last slide, you saw an image of a person holding a weapon, right? And I'm not just saying handgun, I'm saying a weapon because it perceives a threat in that slide. So if you're seeing that image, when you're watching TV in a movie, yeah, okay, you may close your eyes, you may say, oh, I don't like this, right? You can choose to not watch, right? If you see the gunman walking in your neighborhood, your sense of threat might be increased and you might be like, oh, let me go inside or let me figure out what's happening here. If that same image is someone entering your home and pointing a weapon, you're likely to feel that is more threatening, right? Same thing in terms of school violence. You see and hear about bullying and fights. You can hear about a situation that's happening in another state or in another school district. When a shooting occurs in your child's school, that has a different impact to you, typically. If it's a single victim versus mass casualties, you'll have a different response to that situation. Or if you have repeated violence in your community, you learn different responses and your systems, your brain responds differently. Next slide, please. So what are some of those impacts of trauma? Fear and anxiety, pain, powerlessness, etc. Fear, anxiety. Yes, the next slide, please. That was great. To move on. So you can see that there's some common responses and where they are most prominent in toddlers, school agers, or in teens. And then if we add homelessness to this factor, what do you think you would see as being the major traits that impact homelessness, right? Nightmares, fear, anxiety, headaches, stomach aches. Next slide. So when you see trauma impacting environments and norms, such as large-scale events, disasters in communities, changed perceptions of our environment, and if it's safe, it can change our systems and expected behaviors. It can help us to establish new norms over time. And as the environment restabilizes, the time between events, new norms, etc., can be perceived as unnecessary or irritants. So think about, for a moment, 9/11, right? And the initial responses to 9/11 with respect to airport security, and which aspects of those have lingered and remained, and which haven't. And then what were some of the, next slide, the communal sense of risk, the changes in our security, right? The changes in access to vital records even, right? For military, what about post-traumatic stress, combat responses, or defining what routine training is? So learning to use a weapon against other humans is routine training, right? And then security changes in our school settings, et cetera, in that we learn to adjust our environment to help secure our sense of safety. Next slide, please. So what about your own trauma? Consider trauma, even if you don't think you have experienced trauma. But a traumatic event for you doesn't have to be a big deal, doesn't have to be a tornado, right? Something that made you catch your breath or, hold your ability to think for a moment is a traumatic event, if you experienced it that way. Was it a single or repeated event? Was it community-wide or personal? What was your response to it, right? And what are some of the residual impacts that you have had? Next slide, please. So what have we learned or explored so far? That trauma is not simply crisis, right? That our ability to cope can be overwhelmed. That's what makes it traumatic, is our ability to function is overwhelmed. It comes in many forms. It has many stimulants or causes, right? Race, age, culture, personal traits, environment, occupations, all matter in our response to the events, right? And context counts. Some exposure, different responses, right? Different sense of safety versus risk, right? And types of risk are related to occurrences is common, right? And then our responses to trauma, our coping mechanisms help us survive what we are experiencing as life-threatening. We have that TAF experience that we know we can refocus on one other aspect of that TAF wheel and help us. The brain's auto response system, right? Our personal and community levels of response, trauma response. Sometimes we bond together after a community threat, right? Or community trauma. Responses are interpreted by culture. Sometimes our cultures say, that's no big deal, or what are you so worried about? Others, our responses are taught by our culture as being, this is significant. It can lead to, indeed, a threat to my life. We know that there are lingering impacts, and the response is influenced by resources, history, and our system's policies, right? We know that the lingering impacts can reignite trauma, not only for ourselves, but others, and that it's understandable, our effects are understandable, even if they're irrational. You may be working with someone and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Don't feel that way. Why are you so overwhelmed? You're not being cooperative, right? It's like, no, it may be an irrational response for you that may be triggered by, excuse my language of trigger, may be stimulated or impacted by the individual's own physiological, cognitive, and social responses. Next slide, please. So there's a whole bunch of resources that went into that material. So if fawn is new to you, that examining the 4 trauma reactions out of Florida is an interesting short read from a therapy center, and how to use the recognize and use fawning. And so next slide, please. So this is the end of part 1. I know it's shorter than part 2, but hopefully we've set a stage for understanding and for setting a stage for the next part, which is understanding and implementing trauma-informed care, caregivers, and understanding TAC, trauma-aware communities. So You get to ask some questions if you want. It's time to take a stretch for yourselves. Questions, concerns, how do you want to handle this, Valeria?
Yeah, if we have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or you can drop the question in the chat. We'll get about a minute or so to allow for questions. Um, and we can go ahead and respond. I do see one already in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read it. So it says, this may have been discussed already. Might the sharing of the slide deck be available? So we are going to share the webinar um, once on the YouTube channel and on our COC website. There's also a link earlier in the chat, and we can go ahead and reshare it right now, where you'll be able to access the material that's shared during the presentation today.
And I will be offering to your COC leaders, to your, OHS leaders, some additional handouts from that resources list, the references list that they can determine how to share. So.
Thank you. And thank you, Gershom. So the link is in the chat for those of you who want to see the resources shared today. They're available in the link, and we'll go ahead and share it out later as well. So there is another question in the chat. So it's from Sandra. It says, you mentioned occupational trauma. How does one internally positively overcome this dilemma?
Great. So that's a great question. And we will take a slight look at that in some of our reactions in part 2. But it is learning to adjust to your expectation, right? So there are ways to help prevent the environment, the occupational trauma, from impacting you by, again, using some simple techniques. There are some practice techniques in part 2 that we'll share, some strategies to share, so that you can remain in your environment, you can remain in your occupation, you can remain in your profession and not get burnt out and overwhelmed. There will be some coping mechanisms that we're going to offer.
Thank you, Pat, for that response. Does anyone have any other question? Again, you can raise your hand and we'll go ahead and allow you to ask your question, or you can write it in the chat.
Okay, so if we're not seeing other questions right now, shall we just go ahead, Valeria, or give them a chance to take a deep breath and break here for a minute?
We can go ahead and break. It is 10:44, so 10:49 or 10:50, we can go ahead and resume with part 2, if that's okay with you, Pat, just to
That
allow
sounds
them
great.
a little break between these two parts. So we're going to go ahead and just take a 5-minute break. Please join us for part 2 of today's presentation at 10:50. If you guys have any questions, during this break, you can go ahead and type them in the chat and we'll go ahead and address them once we're back. But for right now, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then we'll be back at 10:50. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm.
Okay, so hopefully we still have everyone on from our short little break here, but it is 10:50, so we are ready to resume part two. Pat, whenever you're ready, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, good, I am. So thank you again. Next slide. Again, I want to make sure that you feel welcomed and not overwhelmed. There's so much information that could be offered in terms of techniques and implementation, etc. We're just going to provide a few drops in that flood of information that's available. And again, I really want to make sure that I really invite you to express your candid feedback, give your questions. Really would appreciate your being willing to share and to help improve this session along the way. Next slide, please. So just like before, lots of information from different resources. There are a few different resources in this one. Next slide, please. And the session overview is really its key reminders about trauma, what's TIC-TAC, and core concepts in the HUD trainings, as well as tips and techniques. Because you have just engaged in part one, we'll move pretty quickly through the first section, that key reminders about trauma. Next slide, please. So again, we know trauma has both behaviors and symptoms, right? Interacts and impacts caregivers. We reframe our interactions along the way. So there's some regulatory barriers. There's some tips and techniques that we'll be looking at. Next slide, please. This is where I've said we're going to really quick review over this one. Next slide, please. We had a 3E definition of trauma that showed that it needed to have a lasting effect on you. Next slide, please. Is that some of the basics about trauma is that it can be a single event that is catastrophic, could be a series of events. When I say catastrophic, I mean impacts you. It doesn't have to be a catastrophe for others. It just needs to impact you. And it depends on a whole host of contexts. Next slide, please. Is that trauma is influenced by a series of factors, including the capacity to meet human need, right? Common human need. I want to remind you that virtually all trauma has complexity, even though complex trauma deals with early trauma that is deep and pervasive, is that almost all trauma has complexity that is impacted by personal and societal factors. Next slide, please. We took a quick look at some of the factors or causes, right? Some of the stimuli for trauma, and touched just very briefly on secondary trauma, which we'll take a look at in this section. Next slide, please. We saw reactions to trauma, that interruption of the TAF wheel, our brain functions, how we perceive danger and how we respond to it, including fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And then the residual effects that can happen, which are both short-term and long-term. And then we looked a little bit at the concept of disproportionality, is that the level of reaction may seem irrational to the level of incident, right? Next slide, please. Just a reminder that trauma impacts multiple systems that we see there, and that most people have some level of trauma experience for them. It may not be the same for others. And whether or not we consider them big or not, caregivers are not exempt from trauma and are quite often exposed to others' trauma. Next slide, please. So now let's look at some new material. So some new things, some new effects of trauma here. So trauma impacts memory, concentration, new learning, and focus. And we touched on focus previously. Trauma has been correlated with heart disease, obesity, addiction, pulmonary illness, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, cancer, right? Trauma, and that's research connection. Trauma impacts individuals' ability to trust, cope, form healthy relationships, respond, right? Impacts our self-image and our hierarchy of meeting our human needs, right? Trauma disrupts emotional identification, our ability to self-soothe or control our expression of our emotions. Trauma disrupts the ability to distinguish between what's safe and what's unsafe, right? And trauma shapes a person's belief about themselves and others, shapes the person's ability to engage in hope, to see outlook on life, even if the life outlook is short-term, like tomorrow. Next slide, please. So the first section we're going to look at is trauma-informed care, trauma-aware communities, and how that is displayed in HUD Notice of Funding Opportunities, which many of you are engaged with, right? So next slide, please. So trauma-informed care is an approach to engaging with each other. It's not just a prescription for action, right? It's an entire mindset and approach, right? It works to ensure that all people feel physically and emotionally safe, feel empowered and listened to. It promotes individual trust, choice, and collaboration, even though the person may be stymied in terms of being able to act, right? And presumes that individuals may have a history of trauma and responds to care, and what has happened when they've had previous trauma, what has happened in terms of recovery for that. Recognize the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges the role that trauma may play in an individual's life, including both the survivor and the provider. When I say survivor, the survivor of trauma, right? And employs cultural competencies in interactions with others. And we're going to talk some about cultural competence. Next slide, please. So what about trauma-aware community? A trauma-aware community, as opposed to trauma-informed response at an individual level, recognizes the prevalence of trauma throughout our community and in people, realizes the impact of trauma on entire systems, responds in compassionate, informed manner that honors the individual, that prioritizes safety over other outcomes, and prioritizes respect for the individual's experience response, regardless of if we find it to be realistic for us or not, right? The community develops community norms that are informed by a knowledge of trauma and its impacts, so that we don't misinterpret what happens in community, and recognize that sometimes communities respond more together post-trauma, right? And educates its members and promotes trauma-informed care policies, right? So at that community level, what do we do together? Next slide, please. Trauma improvement protocols. So this begins to address some of the question that was asked in session 1. So, offers ways to improve traumatic response by our providers, right? How do we respond as providers, and how do we as providers, caregivers, able to assist ourselves? These are research-based protocols and proven practices. It knows that knowing about trauma is not enough to help us, right? Knowing about trauma, having trauma-informed care lessons in terms of, oh, here's what we think about trauma, is insufficient to actually improve our protocols, right? We need to result in a dynamic process of cultural competency and interaction that honors and respects the individual differences, and that acknowledges how our interactions are also influenced by our own trauma history. Includes an understanding of social and ecological impacts, encompasses recovery in terms of health, home, purpose, community, personal resilience, identifies symptoms of trauma, right? And works to limit re-traumatization, compassion fatigue, and secondary trauma. And we're going to talk about some of those techniques that we're being asked about. So next slide, please. The tip series that I just mentioned actually is in tip series 57, is in a 300-page guidebook. that looks at individual factors and interpersonal factors. It's in your references in this slideshow, and provides tips on how to spot trauma symptoms in yourself and in others. So some of the tidbits and tips, just a sprinkling, right? It's like what happened is not as important as what the trauma means to the individual. So you need to accept the person's experience and story without challenge. They may say, I was abused as a child. And you go, there's nothing in your history that says that, right? If their experience or their memory says that they experienced abuse, your tip is to act in accord with that belief, with that experience, right? Subthreshold trauma is real. You don't have to have a PTSD diagnosis in order to have lasting trauma response, right? You're going to respond to the symptoms. You're going to respond to the behaviors, not the diagnosis, right? Watch for decline in daily activities. Focus on coping skills. When decline is occurring, what can we do to help remedy? How can we point this out without being re-traumatizing, right? Recognize immediate and delayed reactions, and that symptoms and long-term reactions differ, right? And we need to learn about the delayed or repeated responses, so that when something is not happening, when we don't see an event currently, but we're still seeing a trauma response, what do we do about that? How do we recognize that? How do we understand that, right? And consistency and connection matter. Is that consistency in our behavior and our interactions and our acceptance, along with that sense of connectivity to others, think of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs here, are critical to some of the trauma recovery, right? Trying to halt or soothe away responses that act as warning systems can be dangerous. Those actions are important to the individual's functioning. So if you were in the human services, psychological industry, behavioral health industry, you probably recognize that action absorbs anxiety, is that people will bounce, right? They'll walk, they'll pace, they might, throw pillows, etc. Is that it's important to not disrupt that reaction. It may be disrupting to you, it may be distracting to you to have the person pacing back and forth. But when you stop their physical action, you're forcing that think, act, feel wheel to go to either feelings or thinking instead. And when you force the interaction, the action to be diminished, the typical first response is an increased overwhelming of either feeling or cognition. And that's typically not what you're trying to engage in, right? So remember that. So avoid re-engaging trauma events for individuals by doing role play, by retelling details, by asking them to compare with others or comparing their trauma to someone. Oh, that's no big deal, right? That's nothing compared to this, my student who, right? X. I want to note here, though, that eye movement desensitization and reprocessing does indeed intentionally re-engage trauma response by unlocking some parts of the brain where the trauma has been stuffed to make it possible to continue functioning. EMDR is an intentional reconnection to some of those experiences that have been stuffed away so that they can be reprocessed and allow for better functioning. So that is a difference between the concepts and the tips, right? And then community-based strategies do differ from individual ones, and it is important that we tailor our responses to fit the individual group or community, and that a community catharsis may be appropriate for historic trauma, right? Next slide, please. Trauma-informed care and DV functioning, DV funds under HUD. Again, DV funds are applications for funding for domestic violence, VAWA response. center on person-centered, trauma-informed care, safety planning, empowerment and choice, strengths-based recovery, trusting partnerships built over time, and having partners being active in decision-making. Includes housing first, foundational to meeting human need. Let's meet that foundational aspect of Maslow's hierarchy before we're asking to move up the system, right? Include positive coaching, that is helping someone reprocess, right? Honors client decisions, even if you disagree with them, right? Even if you're like, this is not the best decision you can be making, right? You honor the client's decision. It empowers them for response to their own experiences, right? And remembering cultural competency and awareness, and including staff training. So cultural competency is not just about knowing about a culture, it's the ability to actually function within that culture. Next slide, please. Same core ideas as we talk about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed care and reactions. So in terms of Black and Indigenous peoples, there are some similarities between those groups, right? Such as poverty. One of the differences, legal sovereignty for Indigenous people as opposed to persons from our African-American Black communities. And please, I'm not intending to be offensive when I say Black. I know that there is more inclusive language. I'm doing it for efficiency's sake. Okay. So there's systematic racism, right? Intentional exclusion for both groups. There's marginalization and geographic distancing, right? There's disenfranchisement from employment, housing, there's slave labor in both communities. There's access to culturally appropriate education is fairly limited in both communities, and national policy travesties like a lack of civil rights well into the 1900s, or sterilization for these groups, or abuse. In terms of differences, I've already noted that there's difference in terms of legal sovereignty, such as, and differences in terms of the importance of land or ancestry, right? Differences in terms of community organization and hierarchy. Differences in terms of language. The Native American communities have up to 78 recognized languages, right? Healthcare expectations, what is expected from healthcare differs, right? The right to rule Indigenous people on the land, but not to rule non-Indigenous people on that land. That's an important factor. I'm going to say a relatively modern factor that is just being influenced by policies, changes in policies in the last decade. And the importance of proximity to key geographic features like its mountains and watersheds, et cetera, are important in Native American communities and tend to be less important in Black communities unless it's Black immigrants. So just some examples. So next slide, please. So cultural cues, the importance of independence or interdependence of the community is important, right? Family structures or social structures different. So African Americans have more similarities in dominant culture structures as opposed to like having families as opposed to bands or tribes, right? Housing expectations in terms of intergenerationality or overcrowding. So even with normalized sociological studies, we see that intergenerational interactions and expectations are different, for example, Asian American communities as opposed to African American communities, as opposed to Anglo communities. So African American communities have been influenced strongly by, over time, by the early slave experiences where young African American males were taught to bond to the adult women in their community, in their environment, on their plantation, etc., and to bond to African American women, regardless of if they are their mother, their natural mother or not, because they were likely to be sold and separated from their mother at a young age. So part of the survival mechanism was to be bonded to Black women, right? Women in your community, to have respect for that, and to also learn some independence early, because you were going to need to survive outside of that support system. So then we see young African American Black kindergartners and first graders who get misinterpreted for their independence or for their respect and what sometimes people will call cling or disregard, either end of the spectrum, for women. So it's an interesting piece where we forget that long history, right? Housing expectations also in terms of overcrowding. So even in modern times, like now, Asian Americans, Asian immigrants have a different expectation of space and housing, right? So having 12 people share a small housing unit is not unusual in some Asian cultures, right? Think about Singapore for the moment. And so the rule that says you must have X number of bedrooms for X number of people may seem unnecessary, right? So it may seem traumatic if the people in that extended family have to be separated because of the rule. Example, the importance of place is critical, right? Privacy, what we consider private and what we consider public, how we engage with one another in terms of what I'm just going to label as honest interaction. And again, our shame and honor cultures, those are different and influence our, particularly our Middle Eastern, Asian, African American communities. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about homelessness, right? How does this all fit with homelessness? Next slide, please. One of the vulnerable groups is indeed people who are homeless. They are challenged to meet those basic human needs in Maslow's hierarchy. They have multiple daily functions out of their own personal control, where they're going to eat, how they're going to sleep, etc. Well, let me take that back. If they have access to housing, right? They have continuous challenges and loss of continuity, is that day by day is different. There's not a lot of predictability or control, right? They have high levels of physical risk, exposure to illness, and prior traumatic events. There's excess stress. There's developmental disruption, particularly in the children, and then intergenerational trauma, including prenatal trauma, that's been tested and seen in physical and medical health responses. Next slide, please. They are people who are homeless, have those typical reactions that we looked at in part one, the ability to function, et cetera. The cognitive processes, emotional responses, behavioral and actions, all brain responses are also stimulated by homelessness. And responses in 4 functional domains: self-regulation, executive functioning, efficacy, and mastery are impacted. The interactions with problem solving and helping systems are interacted. So what do we see? Next slide, please. We see, in terms of the first 2 dimensions, that is self-regulation and executive functioning, we see impulsiveness, we can see aggression, we can see sensory overload, emotional outbursts, right? Sleep or mood disorders, right? The inability to wait, the formation, a disruption of the formation of trust, right? Those are all typical responses to the homelessness experience, right? In terms of executive functioning, diminished ability to plan, predict, or hold thoughts. Think about our brain reactions when there is a sense of threat, when there's a sense that your survival may be challenged. No housing, They're exposed to the elements. There's less resistance to distractions and poor attention. So it seems like the people we're working with are not paying attention, right? They're distracted. They don't care. It may be just part of the impacts on their executive functioning. It limits the learning from experience, right? It impacts the ability to make decisions. So even when we're empowering our survivors of violence, our survivors of trauma, to make decisions, we're trying to empower them, to give them choice, to support their choice, not give them choice, to support their choices. You may say, well, what would you like? What do you want to do in this situation? They may say, I don't know. And that's true. They don't know because their ability to make that decision has been impacted, and they're not able to predict what the result of that choice will be. It means that it may take additional time to form trust relationships. It may take additional time to wait for a response for someone in counseling session. So if we're saying, oh, we've got 50 minutes to do this, blah, 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 let's get our agenda done, that may not be adequate time for folks who have been homeless or who are homeless. Next slide, please. So in terms of efficacy and well-being, that sense of purpose, a sense of time or urgency, sense of time maybe right now or tomorrow, right? A lack of responsiveness, an impact on their spirituality, which may be their spirituality can help them feel a better sense of well-being, or their spirituality may tell them, for example, that somehow this trauma, these negative responses are because they're not strong enough in their beliefs, for example. It impacts the sense of belonging, right? Who you belong to and who you don't. So remaining connected to the folks on the street may be part of your social network. That is important. And so then when we offer housing and we don't allow visitors, or shared housing is not an option, that can again exacerbate that sense of belonging, right? And it impacts the dynamic temperament and irritability that we will see, and in fact, then caregiver irritability in response, which we'll take a look at in a few minutes. So in terms of mastery, it can impact communication. It impacts the ability to problem solve. Again, that section of the brain just kind of diminishes because it's functioning on or focusing on survival as opposed to making the other decisions, right? It's focusing on reaction. The capacity to complete physical and cognitive tasks, again, may be stuck, right? May be frozen in their ability. Impacts peer interactions and relationships. Sometimes peers become more important. And resorts to repeated or familiar actions, is that they just keep doing the same thing. And it's like, didn't you learn from this, right? It didn't work before. What makes you think it will work again? You know, what makes you think it will work now? That repetition is the result of the diminished capacity to make new decisions and to engage that part of the brain. Next slide, please. So let's take an example, an integrated example in terms of the sense of time. So the time perspective is the ability to envision a long-term future, right? It's limited to days or hours or minutes, or maybe immediate. Is that sense of time, what the future is for the homeless individual, may be just right now, right? The capacity to think, that abstract thought, may be diminished, right? They may have very concrete thinking, very exchange-oriented thinking, transactional thinking, right? They may give high levels of emotional response that are reactive. They have fear, right? Or flight, or they're frozen, or they're fawning and simply doing whatever nodding and doing whatever you say because they're surviving in their cognitive ability. And they may be reflexive. That is, they may experience trauma. Right? The results are that they might be able to remain calm during crisis, right? They may be able to remain alert, but anxious, right? They may fear imminent danger or loss. They are operating in survival mode. And we're going to take a look at a case example in the next slide. Next slide, please. So here's just a very simple event, right? An intake worker tells a person they'll have to wait until tomorrow to see if shelter is available, right? Just tomorrow. The person experiences the information, feeling potential danger, right? Right? There's an immediate time perspective. If they're living in that immediate time perspective, they go into that fight or flight mode, right? They become aggressive, they yell, they threaten as a part of their protective system. The worker responds thinking that this response is excessive, it's attacking. The worker may then feel threatened and their brain goes into protective action. So let's take a look at this transaction, right? So it's only one night from the worker's perspective, but how am I going to be able to survive the night? Will I survive the night? Is the person's fear level perspective, right? The result is the worker sees the person as being unreasonable, threatening, demanding, dangerous, ungrateful for the work. It's like, you're not being realistic. In our system, just waiting till tomorrow is great. I feel successful in being able to perhaps offer shelter tomorrow, as opposed to next week or in 30 days. But for the individual whose time orientation is now, it feels like that in the worker is threatening them. Their decision, their interaction is threatening them. Next slide, please. So the consumer, the client, is feeling agitated, is not accepting the answer, right? They feel at risk. They push back to get what they need. They yell and they threaten is as a reaction to try and survive that fight response, right? To get what they need and perhaps not have to be out at night. They can't envision waiting until tomorrow. There is no tomorrow in their time perspective. Being able to predict and move into tomorrow is not something that they're able to do. They are functioning in this moment in time. They go on to autopilot and they repeat the patterned response that they've had, right? The worker's response, however, is rational. There's just no resources available. What do you expect me to do? They may feel powerless. You know, what do you expect? I'm doing my best. I'm offering you something good. If it's not good enough, fine, right? They begin to feel at risk in terms of their own capacity to fulfill the work and to help, right? They try to gain control, which then may cause the other individual to feel more threatened again. The interaction begins to spiral. The client is banned for their threatening, yelling response, right? Security is called. And again, that idea of threat is reestablished with the client or consumer. And the idea that this is a threatening job may also be re-established with the worker. Both will have automatic pilot responses to this. Next slide, please. The thinking brain is not necessarily working. Caregiver interactions. Next slide, please. We're going to take a look at some of the tips and these. So how do our typical ways of delivering service care leave us at risk of re-traumatization for our customers, consumers, or ourselves? So think about that for a minute. In what way do we do business leaves us at risk for re-traumatization? Somebody just yell out something. What way do we do business leaves us at risk? No ideas?
Just the triggers, like we trigger something, the way we say it, or a certain subject.
Yeah, is we can just start the way we have practiced and been taught to deliver information, right? What about in our system protocols? What about how we approach being able to use our resources or make a decision about what someone receives?
Someone wrote in the chat, Catherine, she put intake rooms loud and disorganized.
Yeah, intake rooms are loud, disorganized. We tend to be hurried. There's lots of other people there, so there's no sense of security or privacy, right? So those are things that, again, can overwhelm our systems, right? And our brain is taking it all in, right? What about our efforts to achieve outcomes? We focus on what's going to happen, right, as opposed to what the individual needs. And we are pushed to do so in order to receive fundings. We need to have X number of positive outcomes, need people move to permanent housing and stabilize, doing ongoing follow-ups, yes, with prior clients, being able to support them, making sure that we're not rejecting people because of their natural responses. Next slide, please. So re-traumatization, what hurts is that in terms of system responses, is policies, procedures, etc. The way things are done, the way we say things are done, is that having to continually retell their story time and time again in order to receive different services, being treated as a number, right? Even though we have a by names list to help people, we still prioritize based on number, right? Procedures that require disrobing or like in medical care can be traumatic, right? Being seen as their label, that is, they're an addict, they're mentally ill, they're schizophrenic, as opposed to looking at the dynamics of how they're interacting, right? They're not given a choice in service or treatment, or very limited choice. It's like, well, this is what we have available, take it or leave it. It's your choice, take it or leave it, right? No opportunity to give feedback about their experience in the service delivery area, or at least to be able to give honest feedback without a sense of threat. It's like, if I tell them that this really stinks, I might not get anything, right? So what about in terms of relationships, power, control, and subversiveness, submission? Is that feeling like they're not being seen or heard because this is the standard response and this is the standard protocol for our interview, right? Violations of trust is that we don't intend to violate their privacy, but we're speaking loudly enough for other people in that crowded intake room or waiting room to hear their name, their history, right? A failure to reassure or to ensure emotional safety, that is, to give support to the individual's experiences. Being non-collaborative is like saying, okay, I've got this available, here's what you need, right? As opposed to, let's work through this together. Does things for rather than with. I'm going to do this for them. I'm going to give them X, right? I'm going to give them access to Y, or let me make this call for you, as opposed to let me sit with you while you make this call to do X or Y, right? And the use of a punitive threat or coercion practices or oppressive language to speed our outcomes, right? It's like, well, you really should do this, right? Or if you don't choose to do that, that's your problem, right? Not, and I'm overstating it. I mean, most workers would not phrase things that way. Next slide, please. But the helping process needs to remember that there are both immediate reactions and delayed reactions. And so you may be seeing a delayed reaction to something earlier than what you just said today, what you just said now. So an immediate reaction is a numbness or detachment, right? A sense of anxiety or fear a sense of guilt, including survivor guilt. I don't even deserve housing, right? A sense of exhilaration, because I've survived, and telling my story again, it reminds me that I've survived and energizes me, but keeps the trauma present. A sense of helplessness can also occur. Physical response, such as nausea, overwhelmed cognition. I just can't think. Let me see if I can clear my brain, right? And physical exhaustion are all parts of the reactions, right? Delayed responses can be irritability or hostility over time that don't seem to be connected to what's happening today. Depression, mood swings, instability, phobias, anxiety, engaging in high-risk behaviors. They take risks, right? Having a sense of shame and avoiding situations. I don't show up for my appointment because I don't feel that I've done a good job, right? Worry, attention to minor aches, somatization. That is, oh, I'm just ill, right? Magical or irrational thinking, and lower resistance to things like infections and common colds. They occur in each of that think, act, feel area. Next slide, please. So remember, those delayed actions you may not be able to tie to a behavior that just occurred right now, right? So some of the power differentials that occur are whether you're trying to be connected to them in a way that is collaborative or not. You need to recognize that there are some unintended power differentials, even when you're seeking to be collaborative, right? Authority and access to resources. You have authority to do some things that they do not. You have access to resources. You may have access to resources that they do not. You have control over your personal space. They may not, right? Whose territory are you in? Are you in your agency office where you're comfortable and familiar? Or are you on the street that's more familiar for them and where you may be more uncomfortable? Decision-making capacity and practices. Complex primary trauma, right? Self-esteem and actualization, interpretation of systems, associations, consistency, and resiliency. So let's think about this for a minute. Let's take a look at that picture on this slide. Looks pretty benign, right? It's like someone is supporting someone else as they work. This is good, right? But is it really benign? Take a look at the symbolism here. Can you interpret the fact that someone is standing versus sitting? Someone has placed their hand behind the person, not on their shoulder, not next to the table on them. Are they working? Are they guiding the individual? Power differentials can set up unintentional re-traumatizations. You are there to help and you have resources and want to offer them. That may in itself seem like a power differential to the folks that you're helping with. Listen to what I just said. Bad. It may set up a power differential when you want to be bonded. So let's take a look at the next slide in terms of what helps, what creates a trauma-informed environment, right? Is that giving choice, safety, choice, being empowering, collaborative, and being worthy of trust, right? And we know that empowerment can be challenging here, right? So create an area that is calm and comfortable. So when someone said earlier, oh, we've got these waiting rooms that are overwhelming, right? That's probably may not be calm or comfortable, right? Providing an individual options within their own treatment and in their own choices, and accepting their denial or refusal, right? Noticing the capacities of the individual, notice and comment on genuine strengths rather than, oh, you're doing well, right? Notice that you keep on trying, right? Or you're good at expressing your stress, or I notice that you are waiting to make a decision, or you are telling me you're not ready to make a decision. Those are all powerful, right? Those are all strengths, right? Making decisions together. It's hard to do because it takes time, and the individual may not be in a situation to make a decision together, right? and providing clear and consistent information. That helps with trustworthiness. If you make a plan, make sure that everyone understands the details of that plan. And when I say details, that means how it's going to be interpreted, when things are going to happen, and how you're going to know to achieve this together. So that, let's say that you're sick next week for the next meeting with someone, and they were supposed to look for a job. Well, what do you mean by look for a job? Were they supposed to prepare a resume? Were they supposed to look at ads? Were they supposed to wander the streets and write down restaurant names that have for help wanted signs in them? Make sure that the information is clear and consistent so that no matter who steps in, you can see, you can agree on what was accomplished, right? And accept the fact that there may have been changes that kept the individual from completing all that they had hoped to do. Or perhaps they were fawning when they made that plan with you and trying to say yes, yes, yes to whatever you were asking, regardless of the fact that they knew that they were not going to be able to do that. Next slide, please. So caregiver self-care. This is the part that you were wanting. So recognizing your reactions, some grounding techniques, recognizing it's not about you. It's not, their reaction is not personal quite often, even though it seems very personal and pointed. Detaching from pain, taking breaks, and time when it's time to quit. So next slide, please. So secondary and vicarious trauma, emotional duress from exposure to firsthand trauma experiences of others, listening to or viewing traumatic events. Vicarious trauma, changes in the inner experience resulting from empathetic engagement with a client. And this term focuses on trauma symptoms and more covert cognitive changes that occur over time. So although they are used synonymously quite often in our language, there are some differences, right? So vicarious trauma is essentially the inner experience resulting from that empathetic bond that you've created and worked hard to create, but can be focused more on a cognitive exchange, where vicarious trauma includes when a person's situation causes your own reactions to feel trauma or overwhelm. Next slide, please. So caregiver reactions to secondary and vicarious trauma are hypervigilance, hopelessness, an inability to embrace complexity, the inability to really listen, right? To avoid clients, to be cynical, to sometimes be angry with their clients, to have sleeplessness, to go home and take out your emotional drain with your loved ones, right? You can have fear, chronic exhaustion, physical ailments. You can minimize the impact. You can have a sense of guilt that you're not accomplishing things, right? You can have changes in memory and perception, alteration in your own sense of ability and self-efficacy, right? A depletion of your resources, both social and emotional, a disruption to your own sense of safety, trust, or independence. Again, creating those interactions for yourself, internal reactions for yourself. The symptoms of vicarious trauma are disturbances in the professional's cognitive frame of reference in areas of trust, safety, control, esteem, and intimacy, right? And emotional depletion in personal relationships and professional burnout and career impacts. I just can't do this job anymore, or I shouldn't be doing this job anymore. Next slide, please. So protective factors are an environment and developmental stage. Quite often the workers are adults, right? With a resilience factor that they have had some success in overcoming stress or trauma in the past themselves, right? Their protective factor is that they get their basic needs met. I get to go home and eat dinner, right? A resilience factor related to that is the ability to predict or rehearse responses. When this happens, I can practice what I'm going to say to my clients, right? You have the capacity for abstract thought. You have the capacity to develop relationships and have typically had some stabilized relationships. Your general health status may be better. We won't assume that it's better because many of us also carry health issues. And we have control over schedules or demands somewhat, not always, but those are protective factors. Whereas resilience factors are, we are trained and informed about perspectives on trauma. We have the capacity for self-merit and reconciliation. We have support systems and resources, and we've been trained on some things that we can do. Next slide, please. Perspectives on that care is that we're not just the stewards of those who have been entrusted to us for our care as our clients, but we are the stewards of our own capacity to be helpful. It is a privilege when others trust us to share their pain, even though it's draining, right? Even when their behaviors and their interactions with us are unpleasant, it's still a privilege that we have, right? They're trusting us with their reaction. We transform the pain. We can turn stress into strength. We have new resiliency. And in fact, there's a whole new resilience training that can be a contender to replace what we call stress management, right? Is that building resilience as opposed to managing stress is important. Resilience strategy is not an approach to help recover or reduce stress, right? Resilience training is designed to help employees become stronger as the result of experiencing their stress. Is that when I experience stress, what do I do? Not how do I get rid of it, but what can I do? Next slide, please. So principles or approaches, remember the think, act, feel wheel, remember trauma-informed care. We can build resilience, we can reframe and empower, right? Some of our techniques are, and we're going to practice a couple of these before we end today. Techniques are relaxation, biofeedback mechanisms, breathing, guided cognition, sitting in time, right? Encouraging personal routines, seeking safety, physical care, making sure we eat well, we sleep, we get exercise, we take time out for ourselves, we make a date with ourselves, and we capture refueling techniques. Students often would carry a 3x5 card, my social work students, 3x5 card that said on one side, 5 things that refuel me. And on the other side of the card was something I can do that's either free or less than $5 to help refuel me. And they would carry it with them and remind themselves when they were feeling stressed to look at that card and to practice one of those. Next slide, please. So grounding techniques. There are grounding techniques that help us with our own trauma. They're short-term management. They are intended to regain our self-control. They are intended to calm our overwhelming emotions. They can be done anywhere, right? They shift attention to our senses, like feeling like our feet touching the ground, feeling grounded, and they reorient us to a self of physical safety. So let's take a look at a couple of grounding techniques. Next slide, please. You may be very familiar with the Egyptian deep breathing activity. This can be done when others are present. You can even do it without folks recognizing that you're doing it. It can be self-guided or it can be group-led, right? It looks at breathing and concentration, and it's a single round of activity. So I want you to practice this for just 1 minute with me, if you will. So I want you to sit, if you can, close your eyes, relax your hands facing your face up, and relax your hands palms up. And I want you to take a deep breath, counting to 6, and then exhaling, counting to 4. Now notice you took in more air than you gave out, right? Imagine that there is an air bubble that entered at your fingertip and it's traveling through your body. You're going to follow it through your body. You're going to follow it as it travels up your arm to the elbow, to the shoulder, across your torso, down the other arm, back to the elbow, and then down that side to your hip, your knees, down to your legs and toes. You're going to come back up your leg, go to your other foot, your other ankle, your other toes, come back up, Come back up your side slowly, taking deep breaths. Get back to your original point of beginning and release the bubble from whence it came. You've just taken a journey through your body, focusing on breathing and concentration. Now open your eyes, shake out, take another breath and shake out your hands to reduce the tension. That activity is something you can do virtually anywhere. You can even do it with your eyes open. However, with your eyes closed is less distracting. Next slide, please. Let's do another grounding technique. This is 5 senses. The technique, again, can be done in solo. It can be done in anywhere. It uses all 5 senses, so it does take a little bit longer to do. You can do it in a planned space or with planned objects or sounds or tastes. If you want, you can do it spontaneously. It takes a little more time than some of the other grounding techniques, but let's talk through this. So I want you to think about a quiet location, someplace where you can try and concentrate, so that active waiting room may be a challenging location to try and exercise this. So I want you to think about, if you're not in a quiet location, think about a quiet location. If possible, sit. Right? Place your feet on the floor. Take 3 deep breaths of 5 counts each and releasing them. For the sight aspect of it, I want you to look around the space or imagine looking around the space. If you're not in a place that's quiet and you're imagining your space, I want you to think around your space, right? Think around the space and note objects, colors, etc. Stop the input, and then focus on just one object, color, space, a particular object, right? Then describe it to yourself. What is that color? What's its texture? What's its design? What's your response to it? Close your eyes. Try and remember the object that you just focused on in detail. Talk to yourself silently, and then try to remember what context it was in, right? Open your eyes and see if it has helped you calm or if it has increased your anxiety. Typically, it will have helped you calm. If it increased your anxiety, you may want to repeat with a different sense. Use signs, right? Use touch, use smell, use hearing. What do I hear, right? So in that busy, active room with lots of noise, maybe you focus on one sound. The sound of the door opening, the sound of the phone ringing. Now, the phone ringing may seem like it's going to create some anxiety for you, but if you focus on that ring and you determine, well, what is that sound? How loud is it? And with our cell phones, what tune is it, right? When you do this, where's the sound coming from? What background noise are you needing to exclude? What's the tone? What's the volume? What's the timing of that sound? Does it have a rhythm? Is it sporadic? Is it predictable? Do this for about 2 to 3 minutes and take a deep breath and focus on another sound in that room as well. It may be the crying of a baby. It may be shuffling of papers. But again, focus completely on sound. You can then move to doing touch. So like you can touch your shoulder, you can touch your clothing, you can touch your skin, you can touch your hair. You can focus on what does it feel like, right? So because this helps you focus, right? You can concentrate on the temperature in a room. Like, is this warm? Is it cool? Where's the breeze coming through? Where's the heat? How do I experience this? Because you're grounding yourself in your own experience as opposed to all of what's surrounding you. Next slide, please. So those are just a couple of different experiences. So organizational responses, we'll just spend a couple minutes here. Next slide, please. So organizational responses, our organizational actions demonstrate the importance and our commitment to trauma-informed care and trauma-aware communities, right? Or trauma-aware agency, right? Do your mission and your vision statements align with trauma-informed care and principles, or do they inadvertently, unintentionally contain stimuli that might influence someone's level of stress? Revisit your core documents, particularly your public-facing documents and those given to your participants, to make sure that your content is culturally aware and improved, so that your language and your images are, again, not negative stimuli, but help invite and recognize respect for the individuals, right? Learn about trauma-informed organizational designs, like how does your entry to your building, or how your restrooms are situated, how your intake session center is situated, can assist and make some changes. So if it's too noisy and too distracting, what can be done? If you can't change the environment, can you change the timing of the use of that environment, right? Can you change the expectations of your customers or consumers, right? Listen and honor your constituents, your staff, your consumers, your volunteers. Listen to their feedback. Promote trauma awareness through training, language, and interactions with your team. Offer reflective supervision after trainings, like what did we learn here and how can we function together? Establish and advertise a measurable goal. We're going to try, and one of my measurable goals is to have an organization where our language does not reflect normalization of violence. As an example of something that's measurable, we can see how many words in our documents are inadvertently violent. They may reflect our culture. They may be common use, but they are not trauma informed or trauma aware. So next slide, please. It's again selected references for part 2. Some of them are repeats from part 1, but some of them are new. A wealth of a library there with some great techniques, with some references about how to do X and Y. When I say X and Y, what can you do within your interaction with others, both as consumers in your job and with your family and friends or your church partners, or trauma-informed care. Trauma awareness is not just in our professional life. Trauma awareness is like trauma itself. It crosses the boundaries into our personal and professional lives. And the more we are aware, the more we can manage, deter, or effectively respond to it. So thank you for all of your time today and for listening to a talking head for almost 2 hours. Thank you for taking this journey with us. And questions, comments, I really do want feedback to help improve the session or to tailor along the way. So thank you. And thank you for your willingness to join in today.
Thank you so much, Pat, for this informative and mindful and thought-provoking presentation. We still have a couple minutes, so we're gonna open it up for any questions and answers. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or share any feedback or kudos to Pat, or write in the chat, and we'll go ahead and read those out for you.
I would really hope that in 2 hours you learned at least 2 new things, or were reminded of 2 things that you already knew but perhaps forgotten.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. If anyone wants to ask anything, please feel free to, you can unmute yourself or we can go ahead and pick on you if you raise your hand. Or if you also just want to share any kudos or feedback on here, please feel free to do so while we have Pat on the training. Or again, if another question comes into mind later, you can always email us at the coc@rivco.org email, and we can go ahead and get your response at a later time. But we still have a few minutes, so I'll give it about another minute or so um, to allow anyone to share any thoughts or questions if they have it.
Is there one part of the last 2 hours that should be shortened or eliminated, or a part that should be expanded, in your opinion? That will help me know what to do next, what was effective for you. And please don't be afraid to hurt my feelings. I'm inviting, I'm absolutely inviting your feedback for improvement. Partner with me, help me.
Okay, I do
Great.
see in
Taking
the
more time.
chat, good. Arias, I believe, shared they liked the presentation at is, and then we had Lizzie who shared that they liked taking some time to practice some of the coping tactics or coping skills in the presentation, which I agree. I thought that was great to add that in.
So good. We could do more of those. We could add more of those.
I do see a few more comments, so I'll go ahead and read one from Julie from JFS. She mentioned the entire workshop was informative and effective for me. I would love to bring this training to our case management team. And we have one from Roman who shared, yes, the difference between crisis and trauma was a new thought for me. I forget the slide and the exact quote, but it had to do with circumstances versus time. I'm missing, but it was a good thought. I'll see in the slides again. And we will share, as we shared earlier, we will have these available on their CRC website so you guys can revisit the webinar at a later time.
And I can provide to all of you too, or I can provide to you through the COC a link to that manual that has 300 pages of information and techniques so that you can explore.
Thank you, Pat. I'll go ahead and give one last opportunity for any comments or questions before ending our call for today. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, but thank you again, Pat, for joining us and for sharing this information with us, and for everyone else on the webinar as well for joining us today. I do want to go ahead and just end with our next webinar series, which will be on June 4th. We'll go ahead and send the topic and details at a later time, but just keep in mind the date. So the next one will be June 4th. And if no one has any questions or comments, we'll go ahead and actually, Pat, I want to let you, if you have any other last comments you want to share, but if not, we'll go ahead and end today's call.
Yeah, no, just thank you very much. And thank you for 2 hours of your time. I know what a big investment that is. So thank you all. Have a good lunchtime and I'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, and happy Mother's Day to anyone celebrating. That's coming up this weekend, so hopefully you guys feel that love and celebration. And just have a wonderful month, everyone. We'll see you guys next month.
Right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.